say something about artists and, say, religious or spiritual sages who would might look at the technology that you've been talking about and the science that you've been talking about and say, well, we've known this all along. This is sort of old hat, or and how you integrate that sort of state of consciousness is much different from the scientific way of seeing things. And where these people
well, you mean like yogins or something like that?
People shamans that have no need for these ideas.
Well, shamans, I think, are a good case in that apparently they have no need of these ideas. And what I mean by that is their societies are at dynamic equilibrium, left alone, they seem to do fine, so forth and so on. India, I would argue, shows no such ability to deal with its problems. I mean, socio-politically, it's a mess. They should be, and in fact are, very interested in this kind of technology. You see, the difference between Eastern and Western religion, I mean, there are many differences, but an important one for what we're saying here this evening is that Eastern religion is basically timeless. When time is invoked, it's either in the Hindu system where it's chasms of eternity, and they're just cycles upon cycles, or it's the time of Taoism, which is the time of a moment and an insight. The weird thing about Western religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and all the cults that they have spawned, is the insistence that God will enter history, which is a crazy idea. That God will enter history. At a given moment, it will be redeemed, and the hell of toiling for our daily bread and the whole thing will somehow be made right by God's direct manifestation at a certain point. And this idea finds just no support in the East. So then when you ask about how these religious teachers relate to this technical thing, to me, the more interesting relational approach to it is through somebody like Teilhard de Chardin, who I take as my direct inspiration. I never read de Chardin that carefully when he was hot, but since I've come out where I am about all this, I've looked back at it, and he and I are basically in 100% agreement, except I go further. I say the date, and he is crafty enough in his Jesuitical way to stay away from anything so likely to expose you to scorn and ridicule. But what he's saying in The Phenomenon of Man is that we are now generating what he calls the noosphere. And the noosphere is the atmosphere of technical accretions and electronic information transfer and electromagnetic fields, VHF, UHF, so forth and so on. And that this is part of evolution. His great insight was to see geology, biology, and sociology as a continuous spectrum. And McLuhan talked a lot about Teilhard de Chardin. With McLuhan, you never knew whether he was being entirely serious or just going for the good line. But he said that the age of the Holy Ghost, which was to occur immediately before the end of the world, that the age of the Holy Ghost, we had Edison to thank for it, and that the spread of electricity around the world was the direct descent of the Holy Ghost, and that as cities turned to oceans of electric light, he saw it as an epiphany of the third person of the Trinity. This is an argument for keeping Catholics far from the machinery of power. They're clearly screwballs of some sort. But it seems to me that if you make a religion out of consciousness, which unconsciously, I think we in California have done, or that this is what the New Age is about. We worship mind. We worship mind. Well, if you make consciousness your religion, then clearly the body of consciousness is the technical accretion, the superhighways, the computers, the color, the fiber optic networks. All that is how consciousness manifests itself. Consciousness wants, it's as though we're still involved in the alchemical concerns of the 16th century, that consciousness achieves its fullest perfection through the fusion with matter. You know, that the union of spirit and matter, which in materialist scientific terms is crazy talk, doesn't happen. But in the terms of the magical pre-Cartesian attitudes toward matter, this is what they were going for. And in a sense, you know, Mircea Eliade said this. He said, it's ironic that the 20th century, with its scorn for the magical notions of the 16th century, has achieved the full program that those notions set forth. In other words, changing of lead to gold, we do this. It costs a lot of money, but we can do it in our reactors, our cyclotrons. We change lead to gold. We sequence the genome. The secrets of life and longevity are unfolded before us. And then this final thing in the computer. I mean, the computer is the union of spirit and matter. And, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, you used to hear a lot of talk about how computers could never do all kinds of things, and they were simply adding machines and this and that. Well, that's a kind of computer, but those voices have grown strangely muted as massive parallel processing and neural nets and stuff like this. So I don't know where all this rests. You know, James Joyce said man will be dirigible, which is like the flying saucer faith. I would like to think that the philosopher's stone is a suitable goal for human evolution, that we are actually downloading ourselves into a solid state realm where all that moves is ideas in the kind of electronic collectivity of mind, and then the earth is left to itself. But how this is to be accomplished, I'm not sure. But on the other hand, it's not up to me. I mean, if you read people like Hans Moravec, his book, what's it called? Mind Children, The Future of Machine and Human Intelligence. I mean, there are ideas in there so bizarre and far out, and yet, you know, being discussed by someone with a tenured position at Carnegie Mellon University, that all that really holds us back as these boundaries dissolve is our imagination. The difference between the psychedelic experience and history is that history is real. And at the end of it, you're going to be able to stay there, wherever there is, if you want, and do those things. And I think it's coming very, very quickly. Even the wildest things that we've talked about here to save certain theoretical constructs, such as time machines, are now being talked about in the popular scientific press. There was an article about time travel 3 issues ago in Scientific American. So does anybody want to say anything? Yeah.
Do you see a distinction between understanding/knowledge and consciousness? Or do you see those as one and the same thing?
Well, this is a hot and complex thing that's being debated right now. The materialists who hold the high ground in neuromolecular physiology, what they like to say, they're very happy with this formulation, they like to say that consciousness is short-term memory plus attention. This is the new buzzword. Short-term memory plus attention. Actually, Henry James, or William James, said this first, but it's just been brought forward. And if you think about it, that's a pretty good working model. If you say that consciousness is short-term memory plus attention, then it's probably a characteristic of most animals. And so you get a seamless web. Where it gets complicated is that what we seem to be able to do is build very, very flexible models of future courses of action. And this may be a relationship to long-term memory. The relationship of higher animals to long-term memory is not clear. In other words, a mountain lion hunting, does she retain a memory of an incident with important learning embedded in it months and months after it occurs? And in what way does she retain it? Does she retain it as a reflex? Or does she actually, as we do, recall? And when we say recall, we mean picture a scene in our minds from the past and run it forward. How, again, well, this leads to something that I wanted to say, that memory, if you wanted to point to an incredible and significant failure, I've been talking about all these far-out things that have been going on, the greatest disappointment in science, I would say, in the last 35 years is the utter failure of science to make any progress on the question of memory. I mean, I've been following it for almost, well, not 35 years, but 30 years, and they're nowhere. They have not gotten beyond the kind of stuff that Carl Pribram was talking about in Languages of the Brain, which was published in 1973, for crying out loud. Walter Freeman's work, creative, brilliant work, no conclusion. The hardcore materialists have gotten nowhere. And this is a central thing for understanding consciousness, because where are the memories? You know, Carl Lashley was the first person to ask this question, and it's never been satisfactorily answered. And, you know, now there are new theories about interference patterns in the brain and this sort of thing. But, you know, when the telephone was new, neurophysiologists like Ramon de Cajal said the brain was like an international telephone network. Now suddenly we have a hot new metaphor, and we apply it to the darkest area of our ignorance, which is the brain. But, and then, you know, you have the hardcore mystics who say the effort to understand consciousness is intrinsically doomed to failure, that brain cannot elucidate brain. And there's something to be said for that. You know, Gödel's incommensurability theorem and that whole thing. I don't exactly understand what it means to say, explain consciousness. Understand it? I mean, what would that mean? Does that mean we would start with a synaptic event and end with an experience and be able to trace the transition from synaptic event to experience all the way through? I like, and you know, it's a free enough field now, you can say anything you want. I like the idea that the brain is a antenna, not a storage device, and that seeking memory in the brain is like tearing transistor radios apart looking for little men. You know, there aren't little men in there. And so what you have instead is a quantum mechanical antenna. That would make sense, because I really believe nature is a kind of seamless, self-regulating oscillator of some sort. And so it's much more important to be in tune with the larger sets of what's going on than to be isolated from that and somehow inwardly cognizant of what philosophers call an interior dimension of transcendence. I don't believe that. I think, you know, that we are the most existentially isolated of all animal species as a consequence of language. and that part of our difficulty in correctly picturing the mind and its place in nature is the fact that we assume our uniqueness and our isolation and the strength of the ego boundary. But if you saw the brain, that's why, my idea of the culture, the regulation of culture through the psychedelic experience is not that there is something magical about the psychedelic experience in and of itself, but that what it is an attunement to natural harmonics on many levels that we could call, I do call it, the Gaian mind. It's a higher intentionality, but it's not mystical mumbo-jumbo, it's biology. That there's level upon level of pheromones, oscillations, chemical oscillators, all kinds of things that regulate biology besides the gross activation of enzyme systems inside the wetware of an organism. That when you're in a jungle like the Amazon, you see that, this is seamless, this is one thing. It's only my style of knowing that tells me this is a palm tree, this is a crocodile, this is a butterfly. But the way it's all working is it's just genes and gene exchange and life and death and procreation and symbiosis and so forth and so on.